The morning of May 12, 1943. Squadron Leader Terence Bulloch eases his Consolidated B-24 Liberator to 50 feet above the grey swells of the Bay of Biscay, throttles pushed forward, 4 Pratt and Whitney engines roaring at full power. Through salt-streaked plexiglass, he watches the ASV Mark Two radar operator's hand signals. 3 miles. 2 miles. The radar screen shows a contact, but Bulloch needs visual confirmation before he commits to an attack run that will take him directly over a surfaced U-boat bristling with 20mm anti-aircraft guns. 1 mile out, the Leigh Light operator flips the switch. 90 million candelas of concentrated illumination slice through pre-dawn darkness like a blade. And there she is. U-boat silhouette stark against black water, crew scrambling on deck toward their guns. White wakes boiling as the submarine's commander screams orders to crash dive. Bulloch has perhaps 20 seconds. 20 seconds before that boat disappears beneath waves, where his depth charges cannot reach it. 20 seconds to cross 1 mile of open ocean at 200 miles per hour, while flying an aircraft designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, not wave-top attack runs. His hands are steady on the controls. The bombardier calls ranges. At 300 feet, Bulloch punches the release. 4 Torpex-filled depth charges tumble free, skip once across the water surface, and detonate 25 feet down exactly as the submarine's conning tower vanishes. The explosions throw geysers 100 feet high. Bulloch pulls back hard on the control column, climbing away from the kill zone as his tail gunner reports debris and oil spreading across the surface, where moments before a German submarine had been trying desperately to escape. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. One more U-boat that will never reach the massive concrete pens at Lorient or Brest. One more iron coffin settling toward the Atlantic floor, and one more small victory in a campaign that, just 6 months earlier, seemed utterly hopeless. The concrete submarine pens dotting France's Atlantic coast were engineering marvels of brutality. Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, Bordeaux, 5 fortress complexes built by forced labour under orders from Admiral Karl Dönitz, each designed to shelter German U-boats from the aerial bombardment that Allied planners believed would destroy them. The numbers tell the story of their invulnerability. Keraman 3 at Lorient, the largest bunker, featured reinforced concrete roofs 7 meters thick. That's 23 feet of steel-reinforced concrete specifically engineered to absorb the impact of the heaviest bombs in the Allied arsenal. The walls measured 2.5 meters thick. The structures included internal compartments with their own reinforced ceilings, creating what German engineers called Fangrost, blast chambers, designed to dissipate explosive energy through carefully calculated empty spaces. Between January and February 1943, Allied aircraft dropped 500 high-explosive bombs and more than 60,000 incendiary bombs on Lorient, attempting to destroy the submarine base. 90% of the city burned. Churches, homes, shops, everything built from wood or stone crumbled under the bombardment. But reconnaissance photos taken after the raids showed the submarine pens essentially undamaged. Scarred concrete, craters in surrounding pavement. The bunkers themselves remained fully operational. American 8th Air Force B-24 formations tried precision bombing runs against the pens at Brest on August 5, 1944, using the new Tallboy bomb, a 12,000-pound deep-penetration weapon designed by Barnes-Wallis specifically to crack hardened targets. 5 direct hits. The bombs penetrated the roof, but failed to breach completely through to the submarine berths below. Damage was assessed as superficial. U-boats continued operating from Brest without interruption. The British tried 22,000-pound Grand Slam bombs against the Valentine bunker near Bremen in March 1945. These were earthquake bombs designed to reach supersonic velocity during their fall, burrowing deep into targets before detonation. 2 Grand Slams hit the western section of the Valentine roof and penetrated halfway through the 4.5-meter thickness before exploding. The blast collapsed part of the roof downward but did not destroy the structure. The eastern section, reinforced to 7 meters thick, would likely have survived even direct Grand Slam impacts. By mid-1943, Allied bomber commanders faced an uncomfortable truth. The submarine pens could not be destroyed from the air using any weapon in inventory. Tallboys and Grand Slams might crack the roofs eventually with repeated hits, but achieving repeated precision strikes against targets measuring only a few hundred meters across, from altitudes of 20,000 feet, through anti-aircraft fire, was mathematically unlikely. The concrete fortresses would outlast the war, and in fact, most of them still stand today, converted to museums or industrial facilities, monuments to engineering that prioritized pure mass over sophistication. But Dönitz's submarine force did not operate from inside concrete bunkers. U-boats hunted in open ocean. They traveled to and from their bases through waters that aircraft could patrol. And submarines, no matter how advanced their hulls or torpedoes, shared one fatal vulnerability. They had to surface. In 1943, German Type 7C U-boats, the workhorses of the Atlantic campaign, carried battery banks capable of sustaining submerged operations for approximately 90 hours at slow speeds. But submerged running drained batteries rapidly. Every hour, spent underwater pursuing convoys or evading destroyers, depleted electrical reserves that could only be recharged while surfaced, running diesel engines that simultaneously propelled the boat and fed current back into battery cells. This meant U-boats spent significant time on the surface, particularly while transiting the Bay of Biscay between their French bases and Atlantic hunting grounds. The bay represented a choke point, a stretch of water roughly 300 miles wide, where every submarine travelling to or from Brest, Lorient, or Saint-Nazaire had to pass within range of Allied patrol aircraft. RAF Coastal Command understood this. In theory, they possessed the means to hunt surfaced U-boats effectively. In practice, throughout 1941 and 42, results were dismal. Coastal Command managed to sink exactly one U-boat in the Bay of Biscay during all of 1941. By end of 1942, that number climbed to 7 submarines destroyed for thousands of flight hours spent patrolling empty ocean. The problem wasn't courage. RAF crews flew grueling 12 to 14-hour patrols over water, knowing that engine failure meant death by drowning in seas too rough for rescue. The problem wasn't lack of targets. Intelligence estimated dozens of U-boats transited the bay monthly. The problem was that finding submarines in hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean and then successfully attacking them before they submerged proved almost impossible using existing tactics and equipment. High-altitude patrols were useless. A surfaced U-boat presents a tiny visual target, roughly 60 meters long and 7 meters wide. From 10,000 feet, even in perfect visibility, crews simply could not spot submarines reliably. By the time a lookout identified a suspicious shape, the U-boat had usually crash-dived to safety. Medium-altitude patrols improved visual acquisition, but gave submarines ample warning. U-boats posted lookouts who scanned continuously for aircraft. The moment a patrol bomber appeared on the horizon, klaxons sounded. Trained crews could clear the deck and submerge a Type 7C in 25 to 30 seconds. Once the conning tower disappeared, the submarine became effectively invulnerable to aerial attack. Depth charges dropped onto empty water where a U-boat had been achieved nothing. Early radar offered hope. ASV Mark II, air-to-surface vessel radar, could detect submarine contacts at ranges up to 12 miles under ideal conditions. But the equipment had limitations that German submariners exploited ruthlessly. The radar's minimum range was approximately 1 kilometer. Within that final 1,000 meters, aircraft lost contact completely. Approaching through darkness or heavy weather, bomber crews frequently found themselves unable to reacquire visual contact before the U-boat submerged. The RAF tried night attacks. Darkness concealed approaching aircraft from U-boat lookouts, theoretically allowing bombers to close within effective range before being detected. But without searchlights, crews could not aim properly during final attack runs. Bombs dropped based purely on last known radar positions missed consistently. Then, in June 1942, a solution emerged from the persistent advocacy of Squadron Leader Humphrey de Leigh, an RAF personnel officer who had designed a powerful searchlight specifically for illuminating surfaced submarines during nighttime attacks. The Leigh Light, as it became universally known, was a carbon arc lamp producing 22 million candelas mounted in a retractable turret beneath Wellington bombers and later in nacelles slung under Liberator wings. The system was elegantly simple. Aircraft would approach targets using radar, closing to approximately 1 mile while flying between 500 and 1,500 feet altitude. The radar operator directed the pilot's course corrections. At 1 mile, roughly 20 seconds from weapons release, the searchlight operator would trigger the lamp. 90 million candelas of focused light would suddenly illuminate the target submarine. U-boat crews, adapted to darkness and believing themselves safe from visual detection at night, would be caught completely exposed. Some captains froze, others screamed for crash dives while crews scrambled. A few tried manning anti-aircraft guns, but without time to aim properly, their fire proved ineffective. The attacking aircraft had perhaps 15 to 20 seconds of illumination before the submarine either submerged or escaped the searchlight beam, but 15 seconds was sufficient for an experienced bombardier to line up depth charges. The first confirmed Leigh Light kill came on July 5, 1942, when a Wellington of 172 Squadron, piloted by American Wiley Howell, caught U-502 on the surface and sank her with depth charges. But the tactic's true effectiveness emerged gradually as more aircraft received the equipment and crews developed proper attack procedures. By early 1943, Coastal Command was sinking U-boats with increasing frequency, but the campaign still suffered from severe limitations. The command's primary aircraft, Vickers, Wellingtons, and Handley Page Halifaxes, lacked the range to patrol the mid-Atlantic Gap, a vast stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, where U-boats operated with relative impunity. Convoys crossing this gap lost ships at catastrophic rates because air cover simply could not reach them. Allied merchant losses reached crisis levels in early 1943. March alone saw 120 ships totaling 693,000 tons sent to the bottom, 82 of those in the Atlantic. German naval intelligence estimated correctly that these loss rates, if sustained, would strangle Britain's supply lines before Allied invasion preparations could be completed. Dönitz, promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the entire Kriegsmarine in January, threw every available U-boat into the Atlantic offensive, confident that victory was within reach. The official Royal Navy history, written by Captain Stephen Roskill after the war, concluded bluntly, "The Germans never came so near to disrupting communications between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1943. But March represented the peak of German success and the beginning of catastrophic failure. The mathematics of attrition had turned decisively against them, driven by factors Dönitz could not overcome through tactics or determination. American shipyards, fully mobilized for wartime production, were launching Liberty ships at rates approaching 3 per day. These standardized cargo vessels, designed for rapid construction, could be assembled in as little as 40 days from keel laying to launch. Even in months when U-boats sank 200,000 tons of shipping, American production added more tonnage than was lost. The Germans needed to sink 1.3 million tons monthly to offset Allied construction. They never achieved that rate, even in their best months. Simultaneously, Allied escort vessel production accelerated. The Royal Navy and US Navy commissioned destroyers, destroyer escorts, frigates, and corvettes at unprecedented rates. These ships incorporated the latest anti-submarine warfare technologies, improved sonar, radar, hedgehog forward-throwing weapons that maintained sonar contact during attacks, and experienced crews trained specifically for convoy protection. Perhaps most significantly, very long-range aircraft began closing the Atlantic Gap, and the platform that made this possible was the Consolidated B-24 Liberator, originally designed as a strategic bomber, now modified extensively for maritime patrol. The B-24's advantages for anti-submarine work were substantial. Its shoulder-mounted Davis wing, highly efficient in terms of lift-to-drag ratio, gave the aircraft exceptional range. Standard B-24Ds could fly missions exceeding 2,000 miles radius. Very long-range Liberators, modified by stripping armor, removing some gun turrets, and installing auxiliary fuel tanks in bomb bays, extended that range past 2,400 miles. This meant they could patrol the mid-Atlantic gap, providing continuous air cover to convoys that had previously been entirely vulnerable. The RAF received its first Liberators in mid-1941. For 12 months, No. 120 Squadron of Coastal Command, operating with just a handful of early model Liberators, provided the only air cover for convoys in the Atlantic Gap. The aircraft themselves were worn, modified in makeshift fashion, and suffered from reliability issues. But they were the only planes with sufficient range to reach convoys mid-ocean, and their presence alone forced U-boats to remain submerged, reducing their effectiveness dramatically. By early 1943, Liberator numbers increased substantially. The U.S. Army Air Force's Anti-Submarine Command began receiving factory new B-24Ds equipped specifically for anti-submarine operations. These aircraft featured ASV Mark II radar, Leigh Lights, and bomb bays, configured to carry depth charges instead of high-explosive bombs. The U.S. Navy simultaneously acquired PB-4Y-1 Liberators, essentially B-24 seconds with naval equipment modifications. But the aircraft's range, while impressive, meant nothing if crews could not successfully attack submarines once they found them. And here the shift to low-altitude tactics became absolutely critical. High-altitude bombing, the doctrine that governed strategic bomber operations over Europe, proved completely unsuitable for anti-submarine warfare. A U-boat on the surface presented a moving target that could change course rapidly. Bombs dropped from 10,000 feet took approximately 23 seconds to reach the water, during which time a submarine traveling at 15 knots covered roughly 150 meters. Hitting a 60-meter-long target that had moved 150 meters in an unpredictable direction was effectively impossible. Bomb patterns might bracket a submarine's last known position, but the boat itself would be elsewhere by the time weapons detonated. Medium-altitude attacks, from 3,000 to 5,000 feet, improved accuracy slightly, but still gave submarines excessive time to maneuver or submerge. Crews watched helplessly as their depth charges exploded in empty water, where U-boats had been 30 seconds earlier. The solution required bombers to attack from altitudes that seemed suicidal. 50 feet. 100 feet maximum. Altitudes where the aircraft's slipstream kicked up spray from wave tops. Altitudes where anti-aircraft fire could engage with iron sights rather than calculated leads. Altitudes where a single mistake, a momentary loss of concentration, meant flying directly into the ocean at 200 miles per hour. Coastal Command established doctrines specifying attack parameters with mathematical precision. Aircraft would patrol at 1,000 to 1,500 feet, high enough for reasonable visibility and radar effectiveness, low enough to respond quickly when contacts appeared. Upon detecting a submarine, the bomber would descend immediately to 50 feet altitude, approaching the target at maximum speed. Bombardiers were trained to release depth charges at precisely 300 feet from the submarine. Released at that range, from 50 feet altitude, the weapons would skip once across the water surface and detonate at 25 feet depth, approximately 15 to 20 feet from the target hull. This was calculated to be within the lethal radius of Torpex-filled depth charges. The shock wave from one or more weapons detonating that close would crack pressure hulls, flood compartments, and force submarines to surface or sink. The timing demanded absolute precision. Too early, and depth charges would skip over or past the submarine. Too late, and the bomber would be directly above the target when the weapons detonated, potentially destroying both submarine and aircraft. Crews practiced these attack runs obsessively, learning to judge distances by instinct when adrenaline and fear made rational calculation impossible. The 50-foot attack altitude put bombers well within range of German anti-aircraft defenses. Type 7C U-boats mounted either a single 20mm Flak 38 cannon or an 8.8cm deck gun, supplemented in later boats by additional 20mm weapons specifically to counter aircraft. These guns, manned by trained crews, could track and engage aircraft at point-blank range with devastating effectiveness. Some U-boat commanders chose to fight on the surface rather than dive. In March 1943, U-333 stayed surfaced when attacked and shot down the attacking aircraft. Dönitz immediately circulated this success, hoping his submarine captains could repeat the victory by employing better anti-aircraft defenses instead of diving defensively. The tactic occasionally worked. Several coastal command aircraft went down to U-boat gunfire throughout 1943. But fighting on the surface required submarines to absorb punishment while their gunners attempted to shoot down incoming bombers traveling at 200 miles per hour. 50-caliber machine guns in aircraft nose positions and waist positions could sweep U-boat decks clear of personnel. Cannon fire from some Liberators penetrated conning towers and deck structures. Even if the submarine's gunners eventually shot down the attacker, the damage inflicted often left the boat unable to dive or continue operations. The tactical calculus increasingly favored aircraft. A bomber could absorb damage, limp back to base, be repaired, and return to operations. A submarine, damaged 500 miles from port, unable to submerge, faced almost certain destruction. More aircraft would come, surface escorts would arrive, the boat would die in open ocean, far from help. German submariners learned to crash dive immediately upon sighting aircraft, accepting that this defensive response meant abandoning any chance of fighting back. But crash diving required time, and that time gap represented the window where B-24 crews could kill submarines. The Liberator's approach speed mattered critically. At 200 miles per hour, the aircraft covered approximately 93 meters per second. From initial visual acquisition at 1 mile to weapons release at 300 feet took roughly 16 seconds. If a U-boat captain reacted instantly, his crew could have the conning tower underwater within 25 seconds. This left approximately 9 seconds where the submarine remained partially surfaced, vulnerable to depth charges that would detonate alongside the boat as it descended. Many kills occurred in exactly this window, depth charges exploding at 25 feet depth, while the submarine's stern or bow remained near the surface, produced catastrophic damage. Pressure hulls buckled, control surfaces jammed, ballast tanks ruptured. The boat would either blow tanks and surface completely, dead in the water and helpless, or continue sinking uncontrolled until internal compartments imploded from pressure. RAF Coastal Command and U.S. Navy patrol squadrons developed their attacks into well-rehearsed procedures executed with industrial efficiency. Radar operators, called contacts. Pilots descended to attack altitude and pushed throttles forward. Bombardiers armed depth charges and sighted through crude optical markers aligned with the aircraft's nose. At 300 feet, the bombardier would call release and punch the electrical trigger. 4 to 6 depth charges, each containing approximately 200 pounds of Torpex explosive, would tumble free. The weapons were specifically designed for low-altitude delivery. Standard depth charges would detonate on impact with water if dropped from low altitude, destroying themselves before reaching effective depth. The anti-submarine versions used delayed arming mechanisms. Upon release, a small propeller would begin spinning in the airstream. After the propeller completed a certain number of rotations, the arming mechanism engaged. By that point, the depth charge had struck water and sunk to preset depth. Only then would hydrostatic triggers detonate the weapon. This system worked reliably, but required precise calculation of drop altitude and speed. Release from 60 feet instead of 50 feet might mean the depth charge armed too early or too late. Release at 150 miles per hour instead of 200 miles per hour changed the weapon's trajectory and skip pattern. Crews had to maintain attack parameters within narrow tolerances, or their weapons would miss. The human cost of this campaign remains difficult to comprehend fully, even 8 decades later. German U-boat crews suffered the highest casualty rate of any military service during the war. Of approximately 39,000 men who served in U-boats, 28,000 died. That's a 72% fatality rate. Most deaths occurred not in combat, but when damaged submarines sank in deep ocean, taking entire crews down into crushing pressure and absolute darkness. Allied air crews faced their own brutal mathematics. Coastal Command lost 2,060 aircraft to all causes during the war. Many crews simply vanished over the Atlantic, victims of engine failure, weather, or combat damage. Aircraft ditching in heavy seas rarely survived intact. The B-24's belly-heavy design made water landings catastrophic. The fuselage would break apart on impact, sinking within seconds. Crew survival rates after ditching were appalling enough that Coastal Command eventually gave up trying to reinforce bomb bays for water landings, concluding the modifications wouldn't save enough men to justify the weight penalty. But the campaign's strategic impact justified the losses. By April 1943, U-boat casualties began mounting rapidly. 15 boats lost that month. The Germans could accept these losses because their shipyards were producing 20 new submarines monthly, enough to replace casualties and grow the fleet slowly. But the loss rate was climbing while Allied merchant ship losses declined. May 1943 became the inflection point that naval historians would later call Black May, the month when the Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively and permanently in favor of the Allies. The month opened with the battle for convoy ONS-5, a westbound convoy of 43 merchant ships departing Liverpool on April 21st. German naval intelligence, having broken British naval codes, identified the convoy's route and assembled more than 40 U-boats to intercept it in mid-Atlantic. What followed was the largest convoy battle of the war, a week-long running engagement that saw 13 merchant ships sunk for the loss of 6 U-boats and severe damage to 7 more. The exchange rate seemed to favor the Germans. 13 merchants for 6 submarines represented the kind of mathematics Dönitz needed to win the tonnage war. But the battle revealed fundamental shifts that would doom the U-boat arm. The convoy escorts, 16 warships including destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, employed radar, sonar, and hedgehog weapons with devastating effectiveness. They maintained contact with submerged submarines, prosecuted attacks that forced boats to surface, and coordinated responses that prevented wolfpack tactics from overwhelming defenses. More significantly, air cover arrived. Very long-range Liberators from Iceland and Newfoundland provided nearly continuous patrols over the convoy, forcing U-boats to remain submerged during daylight hours. Submerged submarines could not keep pace with surface convoys. The wolfpack tactic, which depended on U-boats shadowing convoys on the surface and radioing positions to allow multiple boats to coordinate simultaneous attacks, became impossible to execute when aircraft forced submarines underwater. After ONS-5, 3 more convoys were attacked in quick succession. 7 merchant ships sank, 7 U-boats were destroyed. The exchange rate had reversed. Then came convoy SC-130, which passed through waters patrolled by 5 U-boats without losing a single merchant vessel. 5 German submarines were sunk attacking that convoy. Admiral Dönitz's son Peter died aboard U-954 during the SC-130 battle, killed when RAF Liberators depth-charged his boat into wreckage. The personal loss devastated Dönitz, but the strategic implications were worse. His submarine force was hemorrhaging experienced crews faster than training programs could replace them. 34 U-boats sunk in May, then the losses kept climbing. Final tallies showed 43 U-boats destroyed during the month, 25% of Germany's operational submarine strength. Dönitz's war diary entry for May 24th reads with unusual emotional weight for a military document. The situation in the North Atlantic now forces a temporary shift of operations to areas less endangered by aircraft. In less formal language, Dönitz admitted to his staff, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." On that date, he ordered almost all U-boats withdrawn from the North Atlantic. Those that remained patrolled areas where Allied air cover remained weak, primarily the gap between Brazil and West Africa. But these distant operations produced minimal results. Fewer convoys travelled those routes, and the convoys that did were increasingly well defended. The strategic consequences rippled immediately. Without the U-boat threat, convoy schedules could be accelerated. American troop transports and cargo ships carrying equipment for the planned invasion of France crossed the Atlantic unmolested. The build-up for Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings, proceeded without the catastrophic shipping losses that might have delayed or prevented the invasion. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical innovations that enabled this victory spread rapidly throughout Allied anti-submarine forces. U.S. Navy escort carrier groups, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, began operating in hunter-killer groups specifically designed to hunt U-boats. These carriers embarked Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, equipped with radar, sonobuoys, and rockets. Operating in coordination with destroyer escorts, the carrier groups would locate U-boats using long-range radar, vector aircraft to intercept, and prosecute attacks with weapons delivered from 50-foot attack altitude. USS Bogue, one of the first escort carriers deployed to the Atlantic, demonstrated the concept's effectiveness in spring 1943. Her aircraft sank or assisted in sinking U-231, U-569, and U-118 in rapid succession during May. The pattern repeated throughout the summer. More escort carriers arrived, more U-boats died. RAF Coastal Command refined its Bay of Biscay patrols into systematic extermination operations. The bay's geography meant every U-boat traveling to or from French bases had to transit waters within range of Liberator patrols, from bases in Cornwall, Northern Ireland, and Iceland. Command established barrier patrols, lines of aircraft maintaining continuous coverage across likely submarine transit routes. The Leigh Light tactics proved so effective that German submarines began surfacing during daylight hours instead of at night, reasoning that at least during daytime they could see attacking aircraft and have some chance of fighting back. This tactical shift actually increased U-boat casualties because daylight visual detection complemented radar contacts. Coastal Command aircraft could spot submarines from greater distances in daylight, allowing multiple bombers to converge on single targets. Between April and August 1943, air patrols over the Bay of Biscay killed 26 U-boats. 17 more suffered damage severe enough to force them back to port. The transit route that U-boat crews had once considered relatively safe became a killing ground, where submarines died with such regularity that German naval officers referred to the bay as the Valley of Death. The introduction of centimetric radar in March 1943 complicated German responses further. Earlier, ASV Mark II radar operated on wavelengths of 1.5 meters, which German METOX receivers could detect at greater ranges than the radar itself could detect submarines. This gave U-boats early warning, allowing them to dive before aircraft closed to attack range. Centimetric radar, operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths, could not be detected by METOX. Allied aircraft could approach to within a few miles before U-boat crews realized they were being tracked. By then, it was too late. The bomber would already be descending to attack altitude, visible on the horizon, closing at 200 miles per hour. Crash diving took 25 seconds. The aircraft needed only 16 seconds to cover the final mile. German engineers attempted to develop radar warning receivers capable of detecting centimetric emissions, eventually producing the Naxos system. But Naxos arrived late, in limited numbers, and proved unreliable. Most U-boats operating in mid to late 1943 lacked effective radar warning, making them vulnerable to surprise attacks they could not anticipate or defend against. Technology shifts alone do not explain the Allied victory. Tactical doctrine mattered equally. The RAF and US Navy developed comprehensive anti-submarine warfare methodologies based on systematic analysis of successful and failed attacks. Operations research teams studied every engagement, calculating optimal attack parameters, weapon loads, patrol patterns, and coordination procedures. These studies revealed patterns that commanders exploited ruthlessly. For example, Analysis showed that U-boats were most vulnerable during the 40 minutes immediately after sunrise and before sunset. During these twilight periods, submarines would surface to recharge batteries, while visibility remained poor enough to provide some concealment from aircraft. Allied patrol planners scheduled missions to ensure maximum aircraft density over known submarine transit routes during twilight hours. Similarly, statistical analysis demonstrated that depth charge attacks from 50 feet altitude produced kill rates approximately 4 times higher than attacks from 100 feet, which in turn produced kill rates triple those of attacks from 200 feet. This data drove aggressive pilot training, emphasizing low-altitude approaches despite increased risk from anti-aircraft fire. The human element cannot be separated from technological and tactical factors. By mid-1943, many Allied air crews had months or years of operational experience. They had survived dozens of patrols, practiced attack runs hundreds of times, and developed intuitive understanding of how U-boats maneuvered when surprised. These veterans could execute perfect attacks in conditions where less experienced crews would fail. German submarine crews, conversely, were increasingly composed of inadequately trained replacements. The veteran commanders and crew who had hunted from Norway to the Caribbean in 1940 and 41 were dead, captured, or pulled back to training duties. Their replacements received abbreviated training because Germany needed submarines at sea immediately. These inexperienced crews made mistakes under pressure, dove too slowly, surfaced in defended waters, and died in consequence. The loss of experienced crews represented a catastrophe from which the Kriegsmarine never recovered. Training a competent U-boat commander required months of instruction followed by multiple patrols under supervision. Training an effective crew demanded even longer. The intensive patrol schedule and massive casualties in 1943 meant Germany was losing experienced submariners faster than they could train replacements to veteran status. By late 1943, many U-boats went to sea with captains commanding their first patrol, crews who had never experienced combat, and equipment they barely understood. These boats died quickly when they encountered Allied escorts or patrol aircraft operated by veterans who knew exactly how to kill submarines. The strategic bombing surveys conducted after the war attempted to quantify the Battle of the Atlantic's impact on Germany's ability to continue fighting. The conclusions were stark. Without secure sea lanes from America to Britain, the Allied build-up for Normandy would have been impossible. If the U-boat offensive had succeeded in cutting those supply lines, Britain would have faced starvation, industrial collapse, and potentially forced negotiation. Conversely, the U-boat arms destruction freed enormous Allied resources for offensive operations. Destroyers and escort vessels that had protected convoys could be repurposed for invasion support. Aircraft manufacturing could shift from patrol bombers to tactical fighters needed for air superiority over France. Most critically, merchant shipping capacity that had been allocated to replacement tonnage could now carry invasion forces and supplies. The cost in lives purchased this strategic flexibility. Beyond the 28,000 German submariners killed, Allied losses included approximately 36,000 merchant seamen, roughly 5,000 Royal Navy personnel, and thousands of RAF and US Navy aircrews. These numbers represent men who drowned in burning oil, who died when torpedoed ships broke apart and sank in minutes, who spent hours or days in life, rafts before hypothermia killed them. The U-boats themselves became iron coffins. When a submarine's pressure hull failed at depth, internal compartments imploded in fractions of a second. Men died instantly, crushed by pressure or drowned when water flooded sealed spaces faster than human lungs could scream. Some damaged submarines remained on the surface, crippled and unable to dive, while aircraft or surface ships methodically destroyed them with gunfire. Survivors often chose to remain aboard burning hulks rather than face the Atlantic's cold water. Allied aircrews faced their own particular horrors. Ditching in heavy seas meant almost certain death. Men trapped inside, sinking aircraft experienced the same crushing panic as submarine crews in flooded compartments. Others survived crashes only to drift in life rafts through storms, dying slowly from exposure while rescue aircraft searched empty ocean. The moral complexity of anti-submarine warfare troubled some participants. Attacking submarines on the surface meant killing men who were often visible on deck, scrambling desperately to reach the conning tower hatch before their boat crash-dived. Some pilots reported seeing faces, watching men fall as 50-caliber bullets swept decks clear. The image of U-boat crewmen dying in the open, directly visible and individual rather than abstract, stayed with aircrews for decades after the war. Yet, none questioned the necessity. The U-boats were attempting to starve Britain into submission by sinking cargo vessels crewed by unarmed merchant seamen. The submarine offensive had already killed tens of thousands of civilians employed in maritime commerce. Every U-boat destroyed represented dozens or hundreds of merchant sailors whose ships would not be torpedoed, whose lives would not end in fire and drowning. The tactical lessons from the Atlantic campaign influenced anti-submarine warfare doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century. The fundamental principle that emerged was simple: altitude equals time, and time equals death. High-altitude attacks give submarines time to escape. Low-altitude attacks compress engagement timelines to seconds, eliminating the target's ability to maneuver defensively. This principle applied regardless of technological advancement. Modern anti-submarine helicopters operating in the 21st century still prosecute attacks from low altitude, using dipping sonar and torpedoes delivered at wave-top height. The weapons and sensors changed dramatically from 1943 to today, but the tactical geometry remains identical. Get low, get close, deny the target time to escape. The B-24 Liberator itself became legendary not for its strategic bombing campaigns, but for its anti-submarine work. The aircraft that closed the Atlantic Gap and helped win the Battle of the Atlantic was repurposed from high-altitude bombing to wave-top patrols, demonstrating flexibility that designers never anticipated. 18,482 Liberators were built during the war, making it the most produced American military aircraft in history. Of these, approximately 3,000 served in maritime patrol roles with the RAF, US Navy, and Commonwealth Air Forces. They flew hundreds of thousands of patrol hours, spotted thousands of submarines, and directly participated in sinking 93 U-boats. When partial credit kills, where multiple aircraft attacked the same submarine, are included, Liberators contributed to destroying more U-boats than any other aircraft type. The aircrew who flew these missions received little public recognition compared to their counterparts in strategic bombing campaigns. There were no major Hollywood films romanticizing anti-submarine patrols. Newspapers rarely mentioned the men who spent 14 hours flying over empty ocean searching for targets they might never find. The work was tedious, dangerous, and unglamorous. Hours of boredom punctuated by seconds of terror became the standard description. Yet these crews fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. Every submarine they sank represented one fewer boat hunting convoys. Every patrol they flew forced U-boats to remain submerged, burning battery power and reducing effectiveness. The cumulative impact of thousands of patrols, hundreds of attacks, and dozens of confirmed kills broke the back of Germany's submarine offensive. The strategic shift occurred with stunning rapidity. In March 1943, German submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than many analysts believed sustainable. By June 1943, the threat had diminished to manageable levels. By August, convoys were crossing the Atlantic with such regularity and safety that Allied planners began scheduling invasion fleet preparations without serious concern about U-boat interdiction. This transformation happened because bomber crews learned to fly at 50 feet instead of 5,000 feet. Because radar operators learned to guide pilots onto targets using primitive cathode ray displays. Because bombardiers learned to judge distances by eye and release depth charges with split-second timing. Because aircraft maintainers kept worn bombers flying through mechanical failures and combat damage. And because squadron commanders developed tactics that turned expensive strategic bombers into effective submarine killers. The U-boats did return to the Atlantic in autumn 1943, equipped with better anti-aircraft guns, improved radar warning receivers, and snorkels that allowed battery charging while submerged at periscope depth. But they never regained the advantage. Allied escorts had become too proficient. Air coverage was too dense. The tactics that had worked in 1941 and 42 no longer produced results. German submarine production continued throughout 1944, building advanced Type 21 boats with revolutionary underwater performance. These submarines were faster submerged than surfaced, could remain underwater for days using advanced battery technology, and carried sophisticated sonar and torpedoes. Had they entered service in significant numbers earlier in the war, they might have changed outcomes. But by the time Type 21s began operations in early 1945, the war was already lost. Germany lacked the fuel, the training programs, and the operational bases to employ advanced submarines effectively. The last U-boat sank an Allied merchant ship on May 7, 1945, the day before Germany's unconditional surrender. The submarine war that began on September 3, 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, ended after 5 years and 8 months of continuous operations. In that time, U-boats sank approximately 3,000 Allied merchant ships and warships, totaling 14.5 million tons. Allied anti-submarine forces destroyed 783 German submarines. The mathematics were brutal and unambiguous. Germany needed to win the tonnage war by sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. They failed because Allied industrial capacity, technological innovation, and tactical adaptation eventually overwhelmed numerical advantages the U-boat arm possessed in 1941 and 42. The concrete submarine pens along France's coast survived the war intact, just as their designers intended. Allied forces captured them in autumn 1944 as the breakout from Normandy pushed German forces back toward the Reich. Engineers inspected the massive structures and concluded that demolishing them would require more explosives than could be practically assembled. Most pens were simply abandoned. After the war, several were converted to civilian use. The Lorient base became an industrial facility and later a submarine museum. Bordeaux's bunker houses an immersive digital art installation. Saint-Nazaire's pens serve as storage and commercial space. The structures remain, monuments to engineering that prioritized invulnerability above all other considerations. But the invulnerable fortresses became irrelevant once the submarines they were built to protect could no longer reach them. The B-24 crews patrolling at 50 feet over the Bay of Biscay ensured that U-boats died in open water, far from the safety of reinforced concrete roofs and blast chambers. The pens survived, the submarines did not, and in that distinction lies the entire strategic lesson. The campaign's key participants followed varied paths after 1943. Squadron Leader Terence Bulloch, who flew anti-submarine patrols with No. 120 Squadron, survived the war and later wrote extensively about his experiences. His memoirs provide detailed accounts of the grinding routine of patrol flying, the terror of low-altitude attacks, and the grim satisfaction of watching depth charges detonate alongside submarines that would never surface again. Admiral Karl Dönitz became Germany's head of state for 23 days following Hitler's suicide, surrendering to Allied forces on May 23, 1945. He was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Upon release, he wrote memoirs defending his conduct of submarine warfare and arguing that the U-boat arm nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic. His claims were largely rejected by post-war analysis, which concluded that German submarines never came close to achieving the tonnage rates necessary for strategic victory. The technological competition that defined the Battle of the Atlantic continued long after 1945. Radar evolved through multiple generations. Sonar became sophisticated enough to track submarines in 3 dimensions, through water layers and thermal gradients. Submarines themselves became nuclear-powered vessels capable of remaining submerged for months, firing ballistic missiles from underwater launch platforms. But the fundamental tactical principles established in 1943 remained valid. When aircraft hunt submarines, low altitude provides the decisive advantage. Compression of engagement timelines to seconds rather than minutes denies targets the ability to escape. Visual acquisition, combined with electronic detection, creates multiple confirmation layers that make successful attacks probable rather than merely possible. Modern anti-submarine warfare aircraft, like the P-8 Poseidon, employ sensors and weapons that would seem like science fiction to B-24 crews of 1943. Magnetic anomaly detectors sense distortions in Earth's magnetic field caused by submarine hulls. Acoustic buoys listen for propeller noise and classify contacts by analyzing sound signatures. Torpedoes delivered from aircraft can actively hunt submarines using their own sonar guidance systems. Yet, these sophisticated weapons are still delivered from low altitude, using attack profiles directly descended from coastal command tactics developed 8 decades ago. The geometry of anti-submarine warfare has not changed because physics has not changed. Altitude equals time. Time equals survivability for the target. Minimizing time maximizes lethality. The lessons extend beyond submarine warfare into broader military doctrine about adaptation and flexibility. The B-24 Liberator was designed as a high-altitude strategic bomber optimized for precision attacks on industrial targets from 20,000 feet. Every aspect of its design reflected those requirements. Turbo-supercharged engines for high-altitude performance, pressurized crew compartments for comfort at stratospheric altitudes, heavy defensive armament for fighting through interceptor attacks during daylight bombing raids. None of those design features were necessary for anti-submarine patrol. Most were actually disadvantageous. Turbo-superchargers added weight and complexity. Pressurization was irrelevant at patrol altitudes below 2,000 feet. Defensive gun turrets and ammunition consumed weight better used for fuel. Yet by stripping unnecessary equipment, installing maritime-specific sensors and weapons, and developing tactics appropriate for the mission rather than doctrine, Allied forces transformed strategic bombers into the aircraft that won the Battle of the Atlantic. The transformation succeeded because commanders and crews recognized that platforms should serve missions, not the reverse. This flexibility, the willingness to employ equipment in roles beyond its original design parameters, became characteristic of Allied operations throughout the war. Tank destroyers were repurposed as infantry support vehicles. Strategic bombers conducted tactical interdiction. Transport aircraft were converted to gunships. In every case, the question was not, what was this designed to do, but rather, what does the mission require, and how can available equipment be adapted to meet that requirement? German military doctrine, by contrast, often prioritized equipment specifications over mission requirements. Submarines were designed for specific performance parameters and employed according to predetermined tactical models, even when those models stopped producing results. The German naval staff recognized by late 1943 that existing U-boat designs could not counter Allied anti-submarine measures, but rather than adapting tactics to maximize existing capabilities, they invested resources in developing advanced submarines that would not enter service until the war was already lost. The Battle of the Atlantic ultimately became a case study in how industrial capacity, technological innovation, and tactical flexibility combined to produce strategic victory. Germany possessed excellent submarine designs, brave crews, and initially effective tactics, but they could not match Allied shipbuilding capacity, could not counter Allied technological responses fast enough, and could not adapt tactics rapidly when initial approaches failed. The 50-foot attack altitude that B-24 crews pioneered represented one small tactical innovation among hundreds that collectively defeated the U-boat threat. Individually, no single innovation was decisive. Centimetric radar helped, improved depth charges helped, better escort tactics helped, increased destroyer production helped, breaking German naval codes helped, very long-range aircraft helped, but the cumulative effect of dozens of incremental improvements, each making submarine operations slightly more dangerous and Allied convoys slightly safer, shifted the strategic balance until U-boats could no longer sink ships fast enough to matter. The transformation happened gradually between March and May 1943, then became irreversible. Modern submarine commanders studying the Atlantic campaign focus particularly on what they call the compression of decision timelines. In 1941, a U-boat captain detecting an approaching aircraft had minutes to assess the threat, decide whether to dive or remain surfaced, and execute that decision with some expectation of success. By 1943, the same captain had seconds. Aircraft appeared without warning on radar-invisible approach paths, descended to attack altitude before U-boat lookouts spotted them, and delivered weapons with such accuracy that defensive maneuvers became futile. This compression occurred because attacking aircraft reduced their altitude from thousands of feet to dozens of feet. That single tactical change collapsed engagement timelines from minutes to seconds. U-boat captains lost the time necessary to make good decisions, execute complex maneuvers, or employ effective countermeasures. They could only dive and hope depth charges missed. Usually, hope proved insufficient. The crews who executed these attacks rarely considered themselves heroes. They were doing a job that needed doing, using methods that worked, accepting risks because the mission demanded acceptance. Many struggled with the violence after the war ended. Watching men die from 50 feet altitude, seeing their faces and their fear, left psychological scars that lasted decades. Yet they also understood that those U-boats were hunting merchant convoys, torpedoing cargo ships without warning, killing sailors who had no weapons and no way to defend themselves. The moral calculus of submarine warfare offered no comfortable positions. Both sides killed men who were simply doing their duty, following orders, trying to survive until the war ended. The strategic bombing surveys concluded that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only campaign where Germany came close to achieving decisive strategic victory against the Western Allies. If U-boats had succeeded in severing supply lines between America and Britain, the war in Europe would have lasted years longer, or potentially ended in negotiated peace that left Nazi Germany controlling continental Europe. That catastrophe did not occur because Allied forces adapted faster than German forces could counter. They adapted by changing how they fought, where they fought, and at what altitude they fought. The B-24 Liberator, flying at 50 feet over grey Atlantic swells while depth charges tumbled toward submarines caught in the open, became the instrument of that adaptation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.